The photo landed in my inbox at 2:47 in the morning. Two little girls, dark skin, dark eyes, standing in front of a Seoul hotel I recognized immediately, because I've stood in front of that hotel. Everyone in Korea knows that hotel. It belongs to Ryu Dong-hyun. No caption, no name, just coordinates. I almost deleted it. I didn't. Because 20 minutes later, a second message came through. A scanned hospital document. Official seal. Date. A DNA result that had been manually altered. Someone inside that building changed the numbers. Erased a father. Erased 2 daughters. And for 5 years, Adaizi has been running from a man who didn't even know he had children. Now he knows. And I have everything. So here's the only question that matters right now. If the hospital falsified that test, who paid them to do it? Let me take you back. Because before the ring, before the twins, before the cover-up, there was a night in Gangnam that someone really, really didn't want photographed. 3 years before I got that document in my inbox, Ryu Dong-hyun was spotted leaving a private members club near Apgujeong with a woman who was not Korean, not a known associate, and not supposed to exist in his world at all. She was tall, elegant, the kind of woman who walks into a room and doesn't realize the whole room turned. Her name? I didn't know it then, but I kept the photo. My editor told me to drop it. It's probably nothing, he said. It's never nothing. Dong-hyun at the time was 41, unmarried. Publicly, he ran a logistics and real estate empire. Privately, everyone in Seoul's underground knew exactly what that empire was built on. He had the kind of reputation that made prosecutors go quiet and rivals disappear. Not violently, just gone, relocated, silenced, bought. He was not a man who showed women to the public. Ever. So when this photo surfaced, Dong-hyun standing outside that club, hand placed gently on the lower back of a woman whose face was half turned toward the camera, people noticed. His people noticed. The photo was scrubbed from every Korean outlet within 6 hours. I'm not exaggerating. 6 hours. Whatever team he had working PR, they were faster than the news cycle. But I had already saved it. And when the whistleblower's documents arrived 3 years later with a name attached, Adaizi Okonkwo, patient file, Yonsei affiliated private clinic, falsified paternity result, authorized deletion, I pulled up that old photo. Same woman. Same woman. She hadn't just been a one-night story. She had been pregnant. And someone had made sure Dong-hyun never found out those children were his. The question was no longer what happened. The question was who had the power and the motive to lie to Ryu Dong-hyun's face and survive. Because when I started digging into that clinic, who owned it, who funded it, who had access to patient files, I found a name connected to Dong-hyun that I was not expecting. And trust me, it changes everything. I almost missed her. She was moving fast through Incheon International. Arrivals, Terminal 2, carrying 2 children's backpacks and a carry-on that looked like it had been repacked in a hurry. She had sunglasses on, head down. The kind of body language that says I've done this before. I'd been tipped off. Someone inside the airport, don't ask me who, had flagged a passport name that matched an alias connected to Adaizi's file. I was standing near the exit corridor when I saw her. She clocked me immediately. That's the thing about women who've been running. They develop a sense for being watched. She slowed down. Her jaw tightened. I held up my press badge. She almost walked past me anyway. I have the hospital documents, I said. She stopped. The twins. I could see them now, flanking her, holding her hands. 5 years old. 2 little girls with their mother's cheekbones and something else in their eyes, a stillness, a sharpness, that I recognized from every photo I'd ever studied of Ryu Dong-hyun. I want to be very clear. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about the story. I was thinking about her, about what her face looked like when I said those words. It wasn't relief. It wasn't fear. It was exhaustion. How long have you had them? She asked, meaning the documents. 4 days, I said. She looked down at her daughters, then back at me. Then you know it wasn't him who ordered it. I did know that. The documents made it clear. Dong-hyun had never commissioned that test directly. It had been ordered through a third party, a legal intermediary connected to his organization, but not to him. Someone had gone around him. Someone close enough to access his private medical arrangements. Someone with both the authority to order a paternity test and the power to falsify the result before it ever reached him. That kind of access, it doesn't come from outside. It comes from inside. And Adaizi, standing there in that airport, 2 daughters gripping her hands. She had known this for years. She had known who did it. She had been too afraid to say it out loud. Until now. Because what she told me next, whispered in that airport corridor while her daughters looked at me with their father's eyes, was the name I least expected. And once I heard it, I understood why she'd been running for 5 years. Wouldn't you? We sat in a cafe on the departures level. Bad coffee. Fluorescent lights. She kept one hand on each daughter, calm, steady, while she talked to me like she'd been rehearsing this conversation for years. Maybe she had. I need you to understand something first, Adaizi said. I didn't run because I was scared of Dongyun. I ran because of what they told me he would do if he found out. She meant whoever ordered the falsification. They had fed her a story. That Dongyun had personally requested the test, personally received the results, and had decided he wanted nothing to do with her or the pregnancy. That he had paid the clinic to make the problem disappear. She believed it. Why wouldn't she? She had no reason to trust anyone in that world. She was a foreign national, alone, newly pregnant, without the kind of legal backing that would let her challenge a falsified document from a private clinic with powerful connections. She took the settlement money, enough to disappear with, and she left. I loved him, she said, and her voice didn't break. It just went very quiet. I know how that sounds. I know what people will say about a woman like me loving a man like him. But I knew a version of him that wasn't in the news. I believed her. I've interviewed a lot of people in this industry. I know when someone is performing grief, and when someone is just telling the truth. She told me about the relationship. 7 months. Secretive, yes. He was a private man, but not hidden in the way that would suggest shame. He had taken her to his family's estate outside Busan. He had introduced her, carefully, quietly, to people in his inner circle. He had been planning something. And then the test came back negative, and he went silent. She didn't know until 3 months ago, when an anonymous envelope arrived at a P.O. box she hadn't used in 4 years, that the silence wasn't abandonment. It was grief. Someone had told him the same lie in reverse, that she had taken the settlement willingly, that the child wasn't his, that she had moved on. 2 people, separated by the same lie, both believing the other had chosen it. Who sent you the envelope? I asked. She looked at me carefully. The same person who sent you the documents, she said. The whistleblower. The same source. Working both sides of the story at the same time, feeding it toward one inevitable collision. Do you know who falsified the test? I asked. She nodded. Are you willing to say it on record? She looked at her daughters. They were drawing on napkins, unbothered, the way children are when they don't yet know the weight of the room they're sitting in. I'll say it, Ades told me, but not here. Not until I know we're safe. And Donghyun, I pressed. He sent a ring. Are you going to answer him? She was quiet for a long time. I spent 5 years being afraid of a man, she finally said, who was out there looking for me. That's not a love story. That's a tragedy. She picked up her coffee. But tragedies, she said, can have different endings. But here's what Adaiz didn't tell me in that cafe, what I only found out after she left. Because 2 hours after our interview, someone had already flagged her passport at the border. Someone who wasn't law enforcement. Someone who wanted to know exactly where she was going. They were already watching her. They had been the whole time. I want to tell you that I was prepared for what came next. I wasn't. Nobody is ever really prepared for the moment when a story stops being a story and starts being something that could genuinely end your career. Or worse. I've covered political scandals. I've reported on trafficking networks. I've sat across from men who smiled at me while implying, very politely, that I should stop asking questions. I know what danger looks like when it's wearing a nice suit. But what happened in the 48 hours after my airport interview with Adiz was different. Because it wasn't just pressure. It wasn't just lawyers calling my editor with cease and desist language. It wasn't just the anonymous messages telling me to walk away. It was coordinated. And it was fast. And that told me everything I needed to know about who was behind it. Because only someone with serious infrastructure could move that quickly. Let me walk you through the timeline. Because it matters. 2 hours after Adiz and I parted ways at Incheon, I received a message from an unknown number. No introduction. Just a single line in Korean, and then translated below it, which told me immediately that whoever sent it wanted to make sure I understood. The story you think you have is not the story you are allowed to tell. I screenshotted it, sent it to 3 separate encrypted backups, kept walking. 40 minutes later, my editor called. Someone had contacted the publication. Not through our press line, not through legal, but through a personal number that was not publicly listed. My editor's personal number. They had requested very calmly that I be pulled from the story and that any materials I had gathered be surrendered. They cited, and I want you to understand how brazen this is, national security concerns. National security. For a story about a DNA test and 2 little girls, my editor didn't pull me. She's one of the few left in this industry who still believes that the moment you let someone with money and power dictate your editorial calendar, you've stopped being a journalist. But she told me to watch my back. She said it like she meant it literally. By that evening, I had 2 more messages. Different numbers. Same energy. One of them included a photo of me, taken earlier that day at the airport, from an angle that made it clear whoever took it was already in position before I arrived. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a demonstration. They wanted me to know they'd been there. They wanted me to feel watched. Here's what I kept coming back to, though. None of this was coming from Dong-hyun. I know that sounds strange. I know the obvious assumption is that the mafia boss, upon learning his secret is about to be exposed, sends the threats. But the more I looked at the pattern, the numbers, the channels, the language used, the speed, the more it pointed somewhere else. Dong-hyun's organization was sophisticated, yes, but they operated with a specific kind of restraint that came from the top. Dong-hyun himself was not a man who made noise. Men like him didn't need to threaten journalists. They just made things quietly disappear. This noise, this urgency, this panic, this was someone else. Someone who had a great deal more to lose from this story than Dong-hyun did. Someone who, unlike him, hadn't had 5 years to make peace with what had been done. Because Dong-hyun, as I was about to find out, already knew. He had known for 11 days. The whistleblower hadn't just sent documents to me and a secret envelope to Adiz. They had also sent a full dossier, names, dates, clinic records, authorization signatures, directly to Ryu Dong-hyun's private legal counsel. 11 days before I was standing in that airport, Dong-hyun had already seen the proof. He had already verified it. He had already identified, with the kind of precision that only comes from having very serious people working very quickly, exactly who had ordered the falsification and why. He wasn't panicking. He was waiting. And the threats that were flooding my inbox and my editor's phone were not from him. They were from the person who knew what Dong-hyun was waiting for, and was desperate, in those 11 days, to burn the story before it ignited. I reached out to Dong-hyun's legal team directly. I expected nothing. A wall of silence, maybe another legal threat, maybe a very expensive lawyer explaining to me in exhausting detail all the reasons I should reconsider my life choices. Instead, I got a meeting. Real ones, in person. A representative, sharp, quiet, impeccably dressed, who sat across from me in a private room at a hotel I won't name, and said very simply, "Mr. Ryo is aware of your investigation. He has no objection to the truth being published. He has one request." "What's the request?" I asked. "That you allow him to speak directly, on record, before the story runs." I stared at this person for a long moment. "He wants to give me an interview?" I said. "He wants to give a statement," the representative corrected. "There is a difference. He does not wish to perform. He wishes to be understood." I thought about Adiz in that airport. I knew a version of him that wasn't in the news. I thought about two little girls drawing on napkins, unbothered by the storm circling their lives. I said yes. But before that interview could happen, something else occurred that none of us saw coming. Something that made the threats, the intercepted passport, the coordinated pressure campaign, all of it, look like a warm-up act. Because the person who had ordered the DNA falsification had decided that if they couldn't stop the story, they would try to discredit the source. They went after the whistleblower. And in doing so, they made a mistake so catastrophic, so breathtaking in its arrogance, that it didn't just expose them. It destroyed every wall they had spent 5 years carefully building. They moved against someone they thought was alone. They were wrong. And by the time I found out what they had done, I was sitting in Donghyun's car. Yes, I said what I said. On the way to a location I had not been given in advance, being told something that made me pull out my recorder with shaking hands. Because the person who had falsified those DNA results was not a stranger to this story. It was someone Donghyun had trusted with his life. Literally. And when Donghyun finally told me who it was, the name, the motive, the full machinery of the betrayal.
Before you continue, if this story touched something in you, you should know this is only the beginning. The complete version includes 30 full audio stories, more than 30 hours of uninterrupted listening. No ads, no cuts, no distractions. Scan the QR code on your screen, or tap the link in the pinned comment to continue listening right now.
I had to stop the recording. Not because I was scared, because I needed a moment to understand that the story I thought I was telling was only half of what had actually happened. The other half was darker, and it had been sitting in plain sight the whole time. There's a moment in every major story where everything you thought you understood gets reorganized. Not shattered. Reorganized. Like someone took all the pieces of a puzzle you'd been assembling and showed you that you'd been working on the wrong side of the image the whole time. That moment happened for me in the back of Ryu Donghyun's car, on a rainy Tuesday night, somewhere on the elevated highway between Central Seoul and a location his team had chosen specifically because it had no cameras. Let me tell you about Ryu Donghyun in person, because the descriptions that exist in the press don't come close. He is quieter than you'd expect. That's the first thing. Men who have spent decades cultivating fear as a professional tool tend to develop a very specific kind of economy. They don't perform anything. Every word costs something. Every silence is intentional. He sat across from me in that car, with the same stillness I'd seen in his daughter's eyes at the airport. And for a moment, I understood exactly what a daze had meant when she said she loved a version of him that wasn't in the news. He didn't begin with the revelation. He began, of all places, with an apology. "I should have protected her better," he said. "When you move in the world I move in, you tell yourself that keeping people at a distance keeps them safe. I was wrong. The distance is what made her vulnerable." I didn't say anything. I've learned that silence in an interview is more valuable than any question. "I received the documents 11 days ago," he continued. "I already knew within 72 hours who was responsible. I waited because I wanted to be certain. I am not a man who moves on assumptions." "And now you're certain," I said. "Completely." He looked at me with a directness that was almost uncomfortable. The person who ordered the falsification of those results was my older brother. The car was very quiet. "Ryu Dongjae," I said, because I had seen that name, obliquely, carefully obscured, but there, in the authorization chain of the hospital documents. I hadn't been able to confirm the connection. I had been circling it for days. Donghyun nodded once, and then he explained it. All of it. The full architecture of what his brother had done and why. And I want to be careful here, because some of what he told me involves ongoing legal proceedings, and I cannot print everything. But I can tell you the shape of it. I can tell you enough for you to understand the scale. Ryu Dongjae was 12 years older than Donghyun. He had spent those 12 years positioning himself as the organizational heir, the one who would take over the family's operations, manage the empire, consolidate the power. And for most of his adult life, he had succeeded. He was the one everyone deferred to. He was the one who made the decisions. Until Donghyun. Because Donghyun, despite being younger, despite being the one the family had originally planned to protect from the business, Dong-hyun turned out to be the one who was actually extraordinary at it. Not in the violent, visible way his brother was. In the strategic, invisible way that actually builds lasting power. By the time Dong-hyun was in his mid-30s, he had quietly eclipsed Dong-jae in every measurable way. The organization followed him. The money followed him. The respect followed him. Dong-jae had never forgiven it. When Daisy became pregnant, Dong-jae saw an opportunity. Not to destroy Dong-hyun outright, that was too dangerous, but to isolate him. Because Dong-hyun, for the first time in his life, had shown something that could be used against him. He had shown that he cared. He had started talking, quietly, to people in his inner circle about stepping back from certain operations, about restructuring, about building something that could exist in daylight, about, if you read between the lines, becoming someone who could have a family without that family being a target. Dong-jae had understood what that meant, before Dong-hyun had even finished thinking it. A child, a legitimate child, a child Dong-hyun acknowledged and chose, would have changed the succession entirely. Would have given Dong-hyun a reason to formalize, to legitimize, to leave in a way that would take half the organization with him. Dong-jae couldn't allow it. So he did what men like him do when they can't win directly. He cheated. He accessed the clinic through a legal intermediary connected to the family's legitimate business holdings. He had the test results altered before they reached anyone. He delivered the falsified result to Dong-hyun himself, personally, with grief in his voice, and watched his brother go silent, with the particular devastation of a man who has just been told the person he loved has been paid to go away. He had used Dong-hyun's own love against him, and then he'd told Daisy the reverse story, pocketed the settlement money from organizational funds, and waited for everyone to forget. For 5 years, it had worked. What changed? I asked Dong-hyun. For the first time in that conversation, something shifted in his expression. Not softened exactly, more like resolved. Someone inside the clinic developed a conscience, he said. They had kept the original unaltered results. They kept everything. They waited until they believed it was safe to release it. He paused. They sent it to 3 places simultaneously, so that it couldn't be suppressed. The whistleblower, who had sent documents to me, an envelope to Daisy, and a full dossier to Dong-hyun's counsel, all at once, knowing that if even one thread survived, the whole truth would eventually unravel. Your brother has been sending threats, I said. To me. To Daisy. I know, Dong-hyun said. He's been doing it for 11 days, since before you even knew you were involved. Is Daisy safe? He looked at me, and in that look was something I can only describe as ferocious patience. She has been safe for the last 9 days, he said. My people found her before his did. She doesn't know that, I said. She knows now, he said. She agreed to speak with me 2 days ago. I sat back. The ring, I said, was not a grand gesture, he said, and something almost like quiet humor crossed his face. It was a question. She has not yet answered it. And your daughters? I asked. First time I'd said it that way. Your daughters, out loud to him. Dong-hyun was quiet for a long moment. Outside the car window, Seoul moved past in the rain. Lights, traffic, the enormous ordinary machinery of a city that had no idea what was being dismantled in the back of one car on an elevated highway. I have not met them yet, he said. That is her decision, when she is ready. I turned off the recorder after that. Not because the story was over, because some moments don't belong to the story. They belong to the people in them. But what I can tell you is this. Within 24 hours of that conversation, Ryu Dong-jae was taken into custody by Korean authorities. The charges are ongoing and I cannot elaborate. What I can say is that the legal case against him was built, in no small part, on evidence that had been quietly, methodically assembled by his own brother, and handed over at the precise moment it would be most effective. Dong-hyun had not acted out of rage. He had acted out of patience, the most dangerous kind. The revelation that stopped my world wasn't the brother. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was this. When I reviewed the original, unaltered DNA results, the real ones, buried for 5 years, There was a handwritten note in the clinic file, in Dongjae's handwriting. A single line, added after the falsification, that I believe he wrote for himself, in the arrogance of a man who expected never to be caught. It said, "He'll get over it." He thought his brother would grieve for a little while, move on, and stay exactly where Dongjae needed him to stay. He had underestimated Ryu Dongyun so catastrophically, so completely, that in his arrogance he had handed the man a reason to become more dangerous than he'd ever been before. Not in the way people expected, in the quiet, determined, legally devastating way. But the part of the story I hadn't published yet, the part that was going to make the ending of this scandal even more extraordinary, was what Adaze decided. Because she had been running for 5 years, and she had been lied to, and she had raised 2 daughters alone in 3 different countries, and the man who was supposed to be the monster of this story had just handed his own brother to the authorities for her. So what do you do with that? What does a woman do when the story she was told about a man turns out to have been written by his enemy? I was about to find out, and so were you. I want to tell this part carefully, because it's the part where the story stops being a scandal and starts being something else. Something that I didn't expect to feel, sitting across from a woman I'd known for less than a week, watching her make the most complicated decision of her life, with the same quiet steadiness she'd carried through every single day of the 5 years before I found her. Adaze answered Donghyun's question 14 days after I first saw her walking through Incheon Airport with 2 backpacks and a carry-on that looked like it had been packed in a hurry. She said yes, but not the way you might think. She didn't say yes to the ring. Not yet. She said yes to something more fundamental, something that in my opinion required far more courage than any romantic answer. She said yes to truth. She agreed to come forward, to give her account on record, to allow me to publish the full story, including her name, her daughters' names, and her version of a 5-year lie that had been told using her body, her grief, and her children as the raw material. "I'm not doing this for him," she told me very clearly when we sat down for our second interview. "I'm doing this for my girls. I don't want them to grow up in a story someone else wrote. I want them to grow up in the true one." Let me tell you about the days that followed, because they were unlike anything I have experienced in 15 years of doing this work. The moment the story published, and it ran long, it ran with documentation, it ran with Dongyun's statement, and Adaze's full account, and the scanned clinic files and the expert analysis of the falsification, the internet did what the internet does. It split into factions. There were people who focused entirely on Dongyun, unable or unwilling to separate the documented truth of what his brother had done from their pre-existing image of who Dongyun was. There were people who focused on Adaze, who subjected her to the particular cruelty reserved for women who become visible in stories that were never supposed to be about them. There were people who read every word and understood, correctly, that this was fundamentally a story about a man who had used deception as a power tool, and had been dismantled by the very evidence he thought he'd buried.
If you stayed until the end, it's because this story stayed with you. What you heard here is just a fragment. The full experience lives in 30 complete audio stories, carefully told with every emotion, every secret, and every moment that couldn't be shared on YouTube. There are no ads, no interruptions, and you can listen anytime, anywhere, in total privacy. Scan the QR code on your screen now, or tap the link in the pinned comment, and discover what was never said.
And then there were the people who just wanted to know about the twins. I'm going to tell you what I can, which is not everything, because 2 children deserve some portion of their lives to exist outside of anyone's content. Donghyun met his daughters for the first time on a Saturday morning, in a location that was chosen by Adaze, on her timeline, with her terms. I was not there. Nobody with a camera was there. That was the agreement. What I know is that Adaze told me afterward that the meeting was quiet and careful, and that her daughters, who are 5 years old and have their mother's nerve, and apparently also their father's unnerving stillness, were not frightened. One of them, she told me, walked up to Donghyun after about 10 minutes and handed him a drawing she had been working on. She didn't say anything. She just handed it to him and went back to what she was doing. Adaze said he held that drawing for the rest of the visit. In the weeks that followed, Ryu Dongjae's case moved through the legal system with the speed that tends to happen when the evidence is overwhelming, and the defendant has exhausted his ability to suppress it. I cannot and will not comment further on active proceedings, but I will tell you that the clinic personnel involved in the falsification were also implicated, and that the authorization chain documented in those files held up under every form of scrutiny it faced. The whistleblower, whose identity I have protected and will continue to protect, reached out to me after the story ran. Not to claim credit, just to say one thing, which I asked permission to include. I kept those files because I knew someday someone would need them. I'm glad the someday was now. Me too. As for Adaiz and Donghyun, I'll be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty rather than a tidy ending. They are not a fairy tale. They are two people who were separated by an enormous, deliberate lie, and who came back together in the aftermath of that lie's destruction, carrying 5 years of separate grief and survival. That is not the starting point for something simple. It's the starting point for something real. And real things take time. What I can tell you is that Adaiz is no longer running. She and her daughters have settled. She has legal protections in place that I helped connect her to. She is working again. She was always brilliant, this woman, and watching her operate in the world without fear is something I did not expect to find as moving as I did. What I can tell you is that Donghyun, by every account available to me, has not moved against a single person who covered the story critically. He has not sent lawyers after the outlets that characterized him poorly. He has not done any of the things that men in his position typically do when they feel the narrative has gotten away from them, whether that represents genuine change or strategic patience. I genuinely cannot say. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the outcome is what matters. What I can tell you is that 2 little girls now know their father's name, their real father's name, and that the name is no longer a mystery or a wound. And I can tell you that a few days ago, I received a message from Adaiz. Short, no preamble, very her. I told him yes, properly this time. Thought you should know since you started all this. I didn't start anything. The truth was already there. I just refused to look away from it. That's the job. That's always been the job. Now, was it a happy ending? Mostly. Was it a clean one? Absolutely not. There are legal proceedings still running, a family still learning how to be one, 2 little girls still adjusting to a world that looks very different than it did 6 months ago, and a man whose reputation is complicated in ways that a single story cannot and should not fully resolve. But the lie is dead. And the people it was designed to erase are still here. Sometimes that's the best ending the truth can give you. And just when I thought I understood the full picture, 2 days ago, something landed on my desk that I wasn't expecting. A file. Not from the whistleblower this time. From a different source entirely. Connected not to Dongjae, but to someone further back in this story. Someone I had interviewed early on and dismissed as peripheral. I haven't opened all of it yet. But what I've seen so far suggests that the falsified DNA test, as catastrophic as it was, may not have been the first time someone in this family rewrote the truth to control an outcome. And if I'm reading these documents correctly, Donghyun may not be the only one who was lied to. I have covered scandals that moved markets. I have reported on people whose names made entire industries go quiet. But I have never, not once, covered a story where the villain turned out to be the man closest to the throne, using family as a weapon and love as a blindfold. Dongjae didn't just falsify a test. He stole 5 years. 5 years of 2 little girls growing up without a father who was out there looking for them. 5 years of a woman running from a danger that was manufactured specifically to keep her isolated. And he thought he'd get away with it forever. So here is what I need you to sit with tonight. If the whistleblower had waited 1 more year, would any of this have surfaced at all? And the real question, the one that keeps me up, who else inside that organization knew what Dongjae did and stayed silent?